Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists did get it absolutely correct, and this is Tom Navolis, your host. I've titled this program Faithful to Foolishness, and then I kind of gave it a subheading there at 18 USC Chapter 115. Now, I need to make it very clear on where we are in our nation at this time, but I want to begin with this, that we are 5 generations of the faithful to foolishness. Beginning with those born in about 1928, known as the silent generation, and to the Gen Z iGeners, we have 5 generations that are deep in want of wisdom and good judgment. We have fallen absurdly and acted in every folly known to mankind. Now, I want to stop there just for a moment because you're thinking that's really harsh in what I'm saying, but I want to go back to the website that defines, and a reference right there at the beginning of the newsletter that defines a year-by-year guide to the different generations. And this is from a Better Parenting website. Not that I think it's probably more on a liberal perspective, but there are these nomenclature for generations. So the silent generation, or those born between 1928 and 1945. And they defined the silent generation, famously got their name for being so conformist that they were silent through the McCarthy era when the fear of communism swept the country. And during this era, kids were expected to earn their way through life using a strong work ethic. Right there at the first part, I wanted to stop again and say, we're going to be going back even before this generation, the silent generation, because it's true, the silent generation was silent and they did not support McCarthy sufficiently in all that was happening with communism in this country, socialism, Fabianism. And I'm going to be referencing quite a bit, once again, that book, None Dare Call It Treason, by John Stormer, written in 1964, because it outlines, it takes, and it was prophetic in so many ways. But more than that, it is why we take and are faithful to foolishness. Because the same points that John Stormer was bringing out in 1964 is exactly in every mechanism and principle that we are continuing to deal with. Maybe these generations should be renamed as the faithful to foolishness across them all, because they all are. So the baby boomers, the baby boomers are as out-of-touch grandparents with the Gen Zers, that's what they call them, but this generation had a wild youth we often don't talk about. Boomers are named for the population boom that occurred after World War II, and many young people of this generation defied their parents, protested the Vietnam War, and created the Summer of Love. Boomers' parents notably redefined parenting by being the first generation to look at their kids' perspective of growing up, and they started the concept of having family meetings. One of the things that I know that I failed in, and most of my generation did, was not understanding the biblical concept. And this goes all the generations now since the founding era did not understand that concept that I talked about last week on covenant. Because if we knew covenant being preached from our pulpits back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, by the time it came to me being a boomer, I would have had the family meetings with my kids under a covenantal relationship, not this other nonsense. Moving on quickly, because we're never going to cover all of this. You're going to have to go and actually read what I wrote in the newsletter. But this is important to set the background. So the X generation was 65 to 80. They were a generation that went through AIDS epidemic, MTV, culture shifting, shifting landscapes, gave the rise then to all of the LGBTQ plus evils. The Generation X parents were the first to use helicopter parenting style, unlike the boomers. So it comes again, what's going on with the kids? The millennials were in the Generation Y, 1981 through 1996. And they were the ones to live through 9/11. Amazon sold only books. First generation to know a childhood both with and without internet, which now plays a significant role in their personal lives. Boomers are, and I'm not going to get into the rest of it. You can read it. The Gen Zers are the first born into a world where they know nothing else besides being constantly connected to one another, albeit through phones, screens, and tablets. However, like millennials before them, Gen Zers are environmentally conscious, new religion, new God presented, inclusive and accepting of others, because they don't understand the distinctions of what is truly truth, and extremely politically aware. Their political awareness, though, is a lot on the left. And despite many of them yet not being of a voting age, now you have this new generation, which we're not considering in those top 5 that I mentioned at the few moments ago. So yeah, I'm harsh, and here's how I come back. I retort my harshness about we being faithful to foolishness in that I'll prove that we have fallen so far from foundational teaching and intent of liberty that we allow the lawfare to become a normality in politics, economics, culture, and law itself. So we're looking at, in particular, in this spring of 2024, we see that 18 USC Chapter 115, which is treason, sedition, and subversive activities, are selectively administered within the progressive, leftist, politicized legal system against those who are Christians, patriots, and people of common sense reasoning. How do I tie the generational faithfulness to foolishness with federal law? We'll get to that. How is the majority of this statute even necessary when foreign entities are gifted with citizenship but never renounce their ideologies? That's what's happening on this campus. You have all these leftists that are there, many of whom have been gifted with citizenship or are here on visas or are even illegals. And if they wanted to become a citizen, they never truly renounced their ideologies, as we'll get into on that oath of citizenship. And you can look at last week's program regarding an oath. So my intent has shifted for this program, okay? My intent for this program was to show more of how our governments, state and federal, even local, when we get to some of the large cities, businesses and churches are in violation of 18 USC, that's United States Code, Chapter 115. But as often happens, the wind changes, and one must tack accordingly to navigate these shifting winds and tides of our times. As you know, I will ad lib, in which I'm doing here even now in the program as I work through the content of the newsletter. So that's why I'm referring you back to SamuelAdamsReturns.net so that you will take and read through the newsletter and all the various references there. So I'm making this last minute insert in the beginning of the program and in the beginning of the newsletter. So just this Wednesday, the folly of the House of Representatives, and here I give you a link, is the House GOP passes controversial bill labeling certain Christian scriptures as anti-Semitic, sparking fears of criminalizing religious belief. Very important that you go look at that, because this anti-Semitism bill uses language in it that makes every pastor at Easter that says that the Jews crucified Christ, and where Paul references it in various scripture of the Jews crucifying Christ, who was a Jew, they crucified a Jew, that is now illegal, according to this legislation, if it gets fully passed. So you need to get a hold of your senators to stop this bill from going through, especially with that language. This bill, I'll mention a little bit more in a few minutes, but I wanted to define for you from Webster's 1828 dictionary, folly. Folly. So this is what Webster defined it as. Number one, weakness of intellect, imbecility of mind, a want of understanding. I even brought up that want of understanding in the very opening of this program. Faithfulness to foolishness is folly. Legislation that has happened over the last 150 years is folly, especially the last 120 years. And I talk about that later in the newsletter. Number two, a weak or absurd act not highly criminal. An act which is inconsistent with the dictates of reason or with the ordinary rules of prudence. In this sense, it may be used in the singular, but is generally in the plural. Hence, we speak of the follies of youth. In this case, I'm speaking of the follies of the Republicans majority. There were a few that voted against the bill, but the folly of Speaker Johnson. So it is an absurd act which is highly sinful and conduct contrary to the laws of God or man. And you can continue with that. It's a criminal weakness, a depravity of mind. So once again, in reactionary legislation with gross unintended consequences lurking with First Amendment assaults on pastors and Christianity in general, once again, Speaker Johnson is showing that he lives for the God of government and not his Christian claims. The legislation does nothing to deal with the underlying subversion, sedition, and even treason being foisted on we the people by business collusion with politicians, the collusion of the leftists and the press, the collusion of politicians and bureaucrats with foreign agents who hate our constitutional republic. So consider this, and we'll probably have to carry this over into the second segment. Consider what a key President Kennedy advisor wrote regarding the implementation of Fabian socialism in the U.S., taken from None Dare Calls It Treason, 1964. I'm down to the last minute, but I'll give you the name. It's Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a Harvard professor and an ADA founder, and I'll tell you who the ADA is in the next segment. He was Kennedy's special assistant, but he was a founder of a group that wanted to introduce Fabianism into the United States. And Schlesinger wrote, and we're going to talk about it in the second segment, he wrote on how this would function back in 1947. The Anti-Federalists, folks, warned exactly what was going to occur, and it began shortly, not too long within the first 50 to 75 years of Americans' foundation. Welcome back to the second segment. This is Tom Navolis, your host, and we're going to jump right back into it. And the way I ended that first segment is that the anti-federalists predicted that if we did not have people of virtue, of moral standing, to take and lead this nation, that America would fall into the folly and the foolishness that it has. And the people would be slaves to all of those who set themselves up above we the people. So let me take you back now to President Kennedy's key advisor. He was a key advisor for Kennedy, a special assistant to Kennedy. In 1947, Schlesinger wrote this: "If socialism, i.e., ownership by the state of all significant means of production, is to preserve democracy, it must be brought about step by step in a way which will not disrupt the fabric of custom, law, and mutual confidence upon which personal rights depend. This is the transition must be piecemeal. It must be parliamentary. It must respect civil liberties and due process of law. Socialism by such means used to seem fantastic to the hard-eye melodramatists of the Leninist persuasion. But even Stalin is reported to have told Harold Lasky recently, and this was back in 1947, so good old Stalin was around. He told Lasky that it might be possible. There seems no inherent obstacle to the gradual advance of socialism in the United States through a series of New Deals. And this is when the New Deal and all of the court actions that happened during the New Deal time under the Supreme Court instituted socialism from a Supreme Court perspective, as well as what Congress did through direct legislation. Schlesinger continues, socialism then appears quite practical with this frame of reference. As a long-time position, its gradual advance might well preserve order and law. The active agents in effecting the transition will probably be not the working class, but some combination of lawyers, business, and labor managers, politicians, and the intellectuals in the manner of the first New Deal. I'll deal with more on the economics later in all of this blending. Schlesinger continues, or actually, this is where Stormer picks up from Schlesinger. Stormer writes then, in these three short paragraphs, Schlesinger confirms vividly what good Americans are called right extremists for saying that the Fabians gradualists are socialists, that Keynesian economic policy is a path to socialism, that goals of communism and socialism are essentially the same, that New Deal welfare state proposals, whether enacted by Democrats or Republicans, my term, are socialist, that establishment of socialism will result in a curtailment of freedom, that socialism and communism appeal not to the working class or the poverty-stricken masses, but to the liberal intellectual, the college professor, and the turncoat businessman. So I could go on, but let me summarize. If you take and you substitute in that paragraph anything dealing with Fabianism or socialism or even communism, and now you put in globalism, which in effect is socialism and communism, that paragraph would read exactly, perfectly for today, because the same ones that are benefiting from this and the same ones that are implementing it are the liberal intellectuals, college professors, and turncoat businessmen. Think Bill Gates when you think a turncoat businessman. So when this introduction to our generations of beginning faithful to foolishness, I mean, this is only the introduction. We haven't even gotten to the other 10 pages that I have written here in the newsletter. So it's a long newsletter. Hopefully you'll read it. That what we now have to look at is going on specifically to the jihadist outbreak across the nation. So what we see on the college campuses right now, how we see this response by the House of Representatives is exactly what the jihadists were looking for. They're calling, they're freaking out on this anti-defamation thing, but it also will apply to the taking down of Christian nationalism, because if a pastor says that the Jews killed Christ, reading from Scripture the trial of Christ from the New Testament, or reading the words of Paul in his writings about the Jews killing Christ, you're going to be a criminal. So we have this jihadist breakout, and it's going to get worse. We're seeing all sorts of things there. And look, I am not in favor of we should get worse for Christ to come. That's not how my eschatology runs. And if yours does, you better get a grip on it, because this is not about Christians needing to be persecuted. This is about Christians not being Christians and standing up for the gospel and the righteousness of people and good government. All right. So I'm going to begin with the fact that we have millions of various ethnic Muslims that have legally and illegally entered the country. Many who are ardent in their faith to Islam. Some that are truly want a better form of economic freedom. Many who have become citizens of these United States. But of those, how many have fully rejected their allegiance, ideologies mandated in Islam? How many? So consider that false rejection of foreign ideologies. As I noted last week, breaking an oath is a crime. And we need to look at the oath of citizenship. Here's what it says. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, of whom or which I have hereforto been a subject or citizen, that I will support and defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I will bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by law, that I will perform non-combatant service in the armed forces of the United States when required by law, that I will perform work of national importance under civilian direction when required by law, and that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, so help me. And here it inserts the idea of the Christian God with a capital G. But my question to those that took this oath, to which God is one swearing the oath? And going back to the very beginning is that to renounce and abjure all allegiances and fidelity to, including sovereignty, Islam makes it and its ideologies sovereign. So can a person of that religion truly take and reject, renounce, and abjure all allegiance to their belief and honorably serve under the God of America, which is now government. So it doesn't matter, I guess. So they do. So where Faithful to Foolishness started. I have no time to get into everything that we're doing. So our generational faithfulness to foolishness is that we became lax, as anti-federalists predicted. They predicted that we would become lax and did not keep, the generations, did not keep check on those who were elected and those appointed in government and education in all the various bureaucracies. So now we have all these modern pundits, authors, and politicians regurgitating truths spoken of 50 or more years ago. And I'm referring to None Dare Calls It Treason by John Stormer, because he was the herald of the corruption in the churches, culture, government, industry, education, and more. 1964. As I've noted before, I've read that book back in 1969-ish, and it's all laid out there. So recently I watched a short portion of Tucker Carlson interviewing a modern author regarding how ancient paganism is manifesting itself today. And the link is there in the newsletter. So this really took me back to not only what I've been speaking of for 20 years, but more so to what Stormer wrote in 1964 regarding the corruption of Christianity and the rise of pagans. And you must remember this: Marxists, Fabians, communists, globalists are rooted in paganism. So please check out that Carlson interview. It was rather interesting. So what is not now. So did you know that in the 50s and 60s, there was a Congressional House Committee of Un-American Activities? Well, the silent generation knew that. We talked about that. They looked into the destruction being done through Christian denominations in the United States, and John Stormer quotes that report. And he writes this in this last minute. Thus far, the leadership of the National Council of Churches of Christ in America, we have found over 100 persons in leadership capacity with either Communist Front records or records of service to communist causes. The aggregate affiliations of leadership, instead of being in the hundreds as first indicated, is now, according to the latest count, into the thousands. And we have yet to complete our check, which would certainly suggest, on the basis of authoritative sources of this committee, that the statement that there is infiltration of fellow travelers in churches and educational institutions is a complete understatement. And that's on page 127 of None Dare Call It Treason. So this is one of the tie points to 18 USC chapter 115 on treason, sedition, and subversive activities, especially when you read and understand the full context of what was happening in the churches and education regarding subversive activities. We've had subversion going on for over 120 years in this nation. Come back for the last segment as I try and tie more together and close this out. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment of Samuel Adams Returns. I do ask those that only get the first and third segment to please go listen to the second segment and also read the whole newsletter at samueladamsreturns.net. I wanted to take you back and just talk about the subversion and the violation that is in 18 USC chapter 115 as I closed out the last segment. And I want you to read and understand the full context of what happened and is happening in the churches and education regarding these subversive activities. So from, once again, John Stormer's book, consider what George Bernard Shaw developed for the Fabian strategy. He helped formulate the Fabian concept of eventual control through infiltration, permeation, penetration, and piecemeal acquisition of power. He strongly admired Lenin and Stalin. He said they publicly championed Marx and his principles of world revolution while quietly working to communize one country after another. They used, Shaw said, the Fabian methods of stealth, intrigue, subversion, and deception of never calling socialism by its right name. Same with globalism. Same with environmentalism. Same with all these things that are now in our faces and are subversive to foundational principles of the Constitution, but through all the different mechanisms of legislation and what happened at the Supreme Court starting in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they were subversive in their Supreme Court decisions in many ways that now we have what Shaw instituted as the plan and how to grow the federal government, the unionization of government workers, the expansion of bureaucracies, and as Stormer identified, the shadow government of the intel agencies and State Department. So consider this, and then I'm going to jump a whole section in the newsletter to the economics. Consider page 33 where it says, Stormer writes, America, however, was learning of some of the treachery in high places. There was an awakening. The story of Yalta and Alger Hiss unfolded. Harry Dexter White, John Apt, Nathan Witt, and other agents who reached top spots in at least 6 cabinet departments before, during, and after World War II were exposed. The role of the institutions of the Pacific relations in the betrayal of China was disclosed. The web of subversion, which reached into the dozens of executive agencies, unraveled. The White House staff itself had been infiltrated as Lauchlin Curie became executive assistant to President Roosevelt. So tell me, what's new in the corruption that came from the Bush administration, the Clintons, the Obama hostile administration, the leftover Obama corruption in all the agencies that Donald Trump had to deal with? And now the Biden, or should I say, Biden administration, to see how the subversion is parallel to the past. Go ahead and read page 35 of Stormer's book regarding Eisenhower and what Eisenhower did to give aid to the communists. It is much like Clinton did with the Chinese, and Obama and Biden have done with the jihadists, and particularly Iran. So what does that mean? And what's happening? Iran now, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, and via the Palestinian Front. the administration, the bureaucracies, the intelligence agencies are full of Fabian socialists, communists, Marxists, globalists, and every other jihadist and isms that I've talked about for the last 10 years. I could go into a section here on the educational system and campus faithful of foolishness, but I'll let you look at that. But just take it for a point is that from Investopedia, I found out that federal money, so we take and we're paying for that faithful to foolishness, $83.9 billion in fiscal year 23 went to higher education. $8 billion to Columbia over the last year or so. Look at all the research and all the garbage that these universities do. That's why they're so controlled and act in the ways they act. And thankfully, the likes of Florida and some others are saying enough, time out, and all this DEI and all the other nonsense that is subversive to our constitutional republic. So let's get to this point real quick in the last few minutes. Faithful to foolishness of economic subversion. So let's start with this. Our rights have taken and been destroyed through the Supreme Court lawfare since the Felix Court, the other courts in the early 1900s have been subverting our constitutional rights. And everybody is asleep and not knowing what to do. So when we look at those past generations, and it's been 5 generations that have allowed and are faithful to foolishness and folly. So that hydra that's out there on the international globalists, environmentalists, and all that are now after your water heaters. Right now, the Biden regime finalizes energy efficiency regulations on residential water heaters owned by almost every U.S. household. The article's there. You can go and click on the link in the body of the newsletter. Now, we can go back and, we don't leave out the whole aspect of what we were talking about under the Kennedy administration. We are in economic slavery. We are. And Kennedy helped close that loop, that subversion. I think Kennedy probably woke up to everything that was going on and all the subversion. And, he truly, even though he comes from a corrupt family, he may have woken up to the point and said, you know what? In fact, he did. He said he was going to expose a lot, and that's why he was assassinated by the CIA. So if you go to the Destruction of Liberties and Rights, starting on page 182 of Stormer's book, let me read to you again, is that government has been the ultimate goal of the collectivist thinkers who have been infiltrating every segment of American life for 60 years. And that 60 years where he's putting that benchmark is 60 years prior to 1964. So that's 1900s, 1904. In government, as in every other field, the collectivists have first infiltrated quietly and then grabbed control. And that's what's happened. So if you think that Trump being elected is going to make a huge difference in any of the departments, the DOJ or any of the bureaucracies, you better wake up. You better get your head out of the sand. It's not going to happen because of these infiltrations since 1900 and before. Remember, Marxism, the Communist Manifesto, came out in 1848. You are even those that listen to this program, many are the faithful to foolishness and folly. There's many that are fighting it, many good friends that I have that are standing up to try and make their way through. But the infiltration and power grab is there. Why do you think everything's happening the way it is to Trump? The seeds of Fabian socialism had already been sown in Washington in the multitude of government bureaus with the passage of the 16th Amendment in 1913 that gave the federal government and its managers unrestricted access to the wealth of the American citizen. Since then, bureaus have been piled on top of bureaus. 2 world wars, the Depression of the 30s, police action in Korea, the Cold War have been used as excuses for creating new offices and departments. Each one usurped or was given by Congress some right of power once reserved to the people, the states, or the people's representatives. Think of Homeland Security after 9/11. Think of what's being reinstituted right now with that 307 insanity of spying on American citizens. Welcome, comrades, to the new United States of communism. The offices were staffed first with a trickle, then with a flood of Fabian indoctrinated theorists and professors from college campuses. Seymour Harris of Harvard Economic Department and a member of President Kennedy's Task Force on Economy, in an article in September 18, 1961 issue of the New Republic, revealed their influence. He said, quote, "Economics is one thing, politics is another. No one has criticized the president for lack of political acumen. I have seen no evidence that Congress is prepared to go along with large deficits except for security reasons. No administration has advanced as far as the Kennedy administration in accepting Keynesian economics," end quote. And there I go into what is economic, Keynesian economics. I go into the advocacy of what it is for the socialism and so on and so forth. But bottom line is that what we have going on is not the road to serfdom, as Hayek put out. We are the serfs now, from a whole economic standpoint, from taking and telling you what car to drive, telling you how you're going to heat your water, telling you how you're going to cook your food, telling you every last aspect of how you are going to live. The Anti-Federalists predicted all this. They said, Brutus wrote, that this Constitution would allow every aspect of one's life, including to your boudoir, your wine cellar, every aspect of regulation would be enacted. And so now right now, we have been experiencing subversion, sedition, and treason by those elected, appointed, and employed into federal service for 120 years, and fully supported by business, which the Anti-Federalists also talked about. I know a lot of you that listen to the program, you have a perspective of what we have to do. But this is why I have to say that you have to vet your candidates. You have to understand that just because they say they're Christian or conservative doesn't mean a thing. They have to be moral agents that are willing to fight for a nation that once again calls its God the whole biblical Reformation God of, yes, what I just said, the Bible, the God of the Bible. Come on back next week when Sam Adams returns with more.